97 people died from the coronavirus in China yesterday, just yesterday. This is a single-day record since this virus was discovered in December.
Wuhan, China, is at the center of this outbreak. It's been under lockdown for more than 2 weeks. Craig Bluen is an American teacher who lives in Wuhan and has decided to stay.
Like all transportation's closed, there's hardly any cars on the road. Most stores are closed. There are a couple isolated grocery stores and pharmacies are still open. But a couple of days ago, I went to one of the grocery stores and the inventory is getting kind of low. They still restock fresh vegetables, apparently. But I know it's like they're running low on rice.
Now, as officials inside Wuhan try to contain the virus, officials around the world are working to stop it from spreading where they are.
And let's go to one of our reporters who is covering this. NPR's Rebecca Hersher is in neighboring Hong Kong. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with the latest here. I mean, if we've hit a single-day record for deaths from this outbreak, I mean, it sounds like this is getting worse.
Yeah, the virus is still spreading. And those 97 deaths that were recorded on Sunday, that brings the total number of deaths from the virus to 908. And the total number of confirmed cases, it's over 40,000 now. Although a lot of public health officials actually think that's probably an undercount. And the latest numbers make one thing really clear, which is that the epicenter of this outbreak is still Hubei province, where the outbreak began. The vast majority of the new deaths and cases are still happening there. And actually, people might remember the SARS outbreak back in 2002, 2003. The WHO, the World Health Organization, for context here, says that about 750 to 800 people died from SARS. So at this point, more people have died from the coronavirus than from SARS. But based on what we know right now, there are actually some really big differences between the outbreaks. If you get this coronavirus, you're a lot less likely to die than you were if you got SARS. The majority of coronavirus cases, they've been mild. So only about 15% of them are severe, 3% are critical. The older you are, the more likely it is to be severe. But even those numbers are kind of squishy, David, because the outbreak has been going on for a while, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And there are tens of thousands of cases in China that they're referring to as suspected as opposed to confirmed.
And we heard that voice from China just describing that scene in Wuhan, which was so striking. But of course, I mean, this is a global issue, obviously. You're neighboring Hong Kong. I mean, what do things look like from there?
People are taking it really seriously here. The universities and schools are closed. It just seems too dangerous to let people gather in classrooms. If you do go out, which I've been doing, basically everyone is wearing a surgical mask over their mouth, even if they're not sick. I've been wearing one. It tells people that you're being careful. If you don't wear one, you kind of get some looks. And the city is really aggressively decontaminating things. Like, there are people cleaning handrails everywhere and elevator buttons and metro turnstiles. There are announcements in the subway telling you to wash your hands. It's just impossible to forget about.
Is there anything, though, on a larger scale that Hong Kong can do to control the spread?
Yeah, Hong Kong has instituted a mandatory 14-day quarantine for anyone coming in from China, even if you're otherwise healthy. And there are fewer flights, there are fewer trains. And people traveling from Hubei province into the U.S., they are also being quarantined for 14 days. That's the longest that we think is the incubation period for the virus. And that's just to make sure that people aren't sick.
All right, the latest on coronavirus from NPR science reporter Rebecca Hersher in Hong Kong. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, it is time. New Hampshire is going to be voting tomorrow.
And unlike the Iowa caucuses, which you saw in person, David,
Yes.
That's a complicated process of meetings that ended in chaos. New Hampshire voters simply show up at polling places for a primary, which increases the odds of a clear winner this time. The narrowing field of Democratic contenders have been sharpening their arguments against each other.
And like the candidates, NPR's Scott Detrow went from Iowa to New Hampshire. He joins us from Manchester. Hi there, Scott.
I like how we're caging our phrasing of it increases the odds of a clear winner.
But who knows what will happen? You cannot guarantee a clear winner, can you?
Anything could happen.
Yeah, exactly. So has the race changed since we left Iowa?
It really has. Even though we still aren't 100% sure who won Iowa, it's had a significant effect on New Hampshire. Joe Biden finished fourth in Iowa, as far as we can tell, and that really threw the candidate running mostly on being the electable one for a loop. And we saw one major change for Biden. He is actually engaging with the other Democrats and drawing contrasts rather than just running like he's in the general election already. And we saw him really critique Pete Buttigieg especially, who may have won Iowa. Biden has essentially been belittling Buttigieg's experience as South Bend's mayor and saying Buttigieg is wrong to compare himself to Barack Obama, as Buttigieg often does on the campaign trail. Buttigieg pushed back on that, saying, sure, I'm no Barack Obama, but neither is Joe Biden, and saying this is a new moment. There's a need for new leadership, making the turn the page argument.
That's quite an exchange. So you had Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders kind of emerging from Iowa neck and neck. I mean, is that sort of duo at the top? Is that what's playing out in New Hampshire?
It is, and while many people are criticizing Buttigieg, Sanders is essentially gaining momentum without getting too much of a pushback from other candidates. This is a state that Sanders won by 22 points 4 years ago. Nobody expects a margin like that this time around, but he and his campaign think that his message about radical changes to the political system really resonate here, especially since, as a Vermont senator, he's got a long track record with New Hampshire voters. You have had a lot of critiques or concerns, rather, from other Democrats about Sanders as a democratic socialist, as he frames himself, what that could mean in November for other Democrats. He has pushed back on that with this specific argument that he made on Fox News over the weekend.
The difference between my socialism and Trump's socialism is I believe that government should help working families, not billionaires.
And David, I've been following Sanders around New Hampshire all weekend. He's feeling very confident. He is drawing bigger and bigger crowds everywhere he goes.
What about Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar? I mean, how are their crowds, and are they still in the mix here?
I think both of them have a lot riding on Tuesday. Elizabeth Warren, she has a well-organized campaign. She's on the left on issues that excite a lot of progressives, a lot of similar policies to Bernie Sanders. But she's got a track record of working within the system and with other Democrats more than Sanders, so you could think she could really occupy that middle ground that so many Democratic voters are looking for. But after finishing third in Iowa, she seems to have really faded from the conversation in New Hampshire so far, raising a lot of questions about how she'll do and what will come next for her campaign. So as that's happening, you are also seeing signs that Senator Amy Klobuchar has gotten a big boost out of Iowa and gotten a big boost since that Friday night debate especially, and that would be among those moderate voters who just don't know who their best option is right now.
I need your vote because I truly believe this will be a victory for getting away from the extremes and the noise and the nonsense in our politics.
She's up in the polls we've seen over the last few days. She's suddenly raising more money. She's drawing more crowds. So I'm really curious to see how she finishes. It's a very unsettled field. New Hampshire could clarify that or make things even more unsettled. But it's important to remember that there's only a few weeks before this really becomes a national primary. So candidates who are trying to get up into that top tier don't have much more time to do that.
NPR's Scott Detrow in Manchester, New Hampshire. Scott, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, the 92nd Academy Awards ended last night with a stunning result.
And the Oscar goes to Parasite.
Parasite from South Korea, the first non-English language film in the history of the Academy Awards to win the Best Picture Oscar. This capped a night in which a lot of the other categories had more predictable winners.
All right, let's go to NPR TV critic Eric Deggans, who is handling our post-movie Oscars night coverage this morning. Hi, Eric.
Hi.
All right, so Parasite really cleaned up last night. This is so significant. It's a movie that is not in English. It doesn't have stars, Oscar stars who we all know. Just step back. Why this movie? Why now? What should we take from this?
Well, I'm not sure why, although there was a sense that Parasite was gaining momentum in some of the award ceremonies leading up to the Oscars, which may have influenced voting. Parasite's success in categories that people didn't expect, with Bong Joon-ho winning Best Director, for example, built some suspense inside the show, and that alternated with these people that we expected to win, like Brad Pitt or Laura Dern. The Academy Awards had taken a lot of criticism for not nominating many people of color in major categories outside of Parasite, and for a lack of surprising nominations. So Parasite was something of a surprise, and their wins, including Best Picture, added an international flavor to a show that could have looked like this long line of white people going up there to get awards.
What did you think of the show in general? I mean, this was the second year the Academy Awards didn't have a host. Is that working?
I think they have pretty much proven you do not need a host for this show.
Got it.
It was well paced, creatively produced. Janelle Monáe and Billy Porter kicked off the night with this great big production number that was amazing. Steve Martin and Chris Rock came out and did a monologue that was smart and funny. Just what you needed to kick off the show. They had some great presenters like Maya Rudolph and Kristen Wiig, who were so funny. I felt like they could have just taken over hosting the show without missing a beat. And even though some people looked a little befuddled when Eminem sang his 2002 Oscar-winning hit "Lose Yourself," Martin Scorsese, I'm talking about you. I kind of liked that performance, And there was a later performance. There was a later rap by Utkarsh Ambudkar, and he was recapping the show halfway through. Let's check out a little clip of it.
Mr. Pitt, congrats on winning your trophy. Now please make a sequel to World War Z. Mindy here.
So, I think the Oscars' biggest problem in the past has been they're not quite sure what they are. Are they this important tribute to serious film? Are they a fun look at great movies? So for the Oscars this year, they amped up the fun and they did much better.
You mentioned the show could have looked like a long line of white people going up and getting awards. What did the show look like to you in terms of this diversity question?
Well, there was an odd tension because on the one hand, it was great to see the wins for Parasite and great to see talented women and people of color featured. But there was also a sense that they were kind of brought in because the Academy may have felt guilty about the lack of nominations in the first place. So I think Parasite's win should be a signal that the Academy should do better in its nominations so they don't look like they're just bringing in people to entertain and segregating the more important elements of the show for other people.
NPR TV critic Eric Deggans talking to us about last night's Oscars.
We have reached the point where the New Hampshire primary is a round-the-clock affair.
Yeah, it really is. President Trump drew thousands of supporters to a rally last night. He is facing scant opposition in the Republican primary. One of his Democratic challengers, Bernie Sanders, drew thousands of supporters to his rally last night, and hardly had the cheers died down when the voting began. In keeping with tradition, residents of some tiny New Hampshire towns voted at midnight.
Democratic voters who plan to show up throughout this day are feeling the weight of responsibility. That's what some are telling NPR's Esma Khalid, who's in Manchester, New Hampshire. Esma, good morning.
Good morning.
What are you hearing?
Well, in essence, I will say I am hearing that a lot of people are really anxious. They're really nervous. I was with Joe Biden at a closing rally last night, and one of the intro speakers asked the crowd how many folks are nervous, and dozens of hands shot up. I mean, that is the mood here right now. I met one woman yesterday at an Amy Klobuchar rally. Her name is Kathleen McLeod, and she told me that she just wants to find the person who she feels is electable. She worries that Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, whom she really likes, may not be electable because he's gay. She worries again that Amy Klobuchar, another candidate she likes, may not be electable because she's a woman, and she just wants to find the right person. Let's take a listen.
I feel like a lot of people are feeling this way, like this angst over finding the candidate that's going to be able to beat Trump.
And so, Steve, that is sort of the backdrop here, and it all is in part because Donald Trump was here himself campaigning last night.
It is remarkable to listen to people not only decide who they like, but trying to be political analysts or political consultants in a way and figure out who they think the electorate will like. There's also this divide between more moderate or pragmatic candidates and more progressive candidates. There's this divide between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the more progressive or radical change side. Is that still a big divide?
I would say that divide is something I heard a lot about throughout the summer into the fall. The progressive movement was somewhat conflicted. People would say that they liked both candidates, but I will say at this point, I hear from many progressive leaders and groups who've come out to endorse Bernie Sanders that they feel like he's kind of the OG. He was the person, originally calling for a lot of this progressive change, Medicare for all and whatnot. And really what we're seeing is a very muddled path among some of the moderate candidates. That vote seems to be particularly fragmented.
Does it seem to you, Esma, that New Hampshire voters are right to feel a lot of responsibility here, that their selection could influence who ends up being the nominee?
I mean, I understand why they feel this way right now, and it's particularly acute because of the mayhem in the Iowa caucuses. And so they do feel an additional responsibility to pick the winner. The other thing at stake for them is that there's been an increasing amount of criticism on both Iowa and New Hampshire that they are not diverse, that they are just too white. They don't represent the Democratic electorate.
And I guess we should note that the candidate field got a lot less diverse before people even reached the New Hampshire voting today.
That's right.
Asma, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Asma Khalid in New Hampshire, where voting has already begun in today's presidential primary. This next story begins with just a hint of extra anxiety.
That's right. Anxiety about the spread of the coronavirus. It has been spreading out of China, and that alone is troubling enough. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus of the World Health Organization finds something else troubling. Doctors can't always trace how the virus has spread.
In recent days, we have seen some concerning instances of onward transmission from people with no travel history to China.
No travel history to China, and still a few people contracted the virus in France and the UK.
The detection of this small number of cases could be the spark that becomes a bigger fire. But for now, it's only a spark. Our objective remains containment.
Health officials, of course, want to contain this disease. They also want to contain the fears in populations around the world.
One place where that work is especially hard is Hong Kong, where we find NPR's Rebecca Hersher. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi there.
Does Hong Kong have its own version of that story that was just told there by the head of the WHO?
Yes, officials here are definitely trying to quell fears and also contain the virus at the same time. There are only about 40 cases here so far. So on that front, it's pretty good, right? But because it's not totally clear about how the virus spreads, new cases that happen here, they get a lot of attention. And they make people really scared. Like, there are these two people who live on different floors of the same apartment building here. Mm-hmm. They both got the virus. It's all over the papers. And as that's been happening, people have been starting to speculate because we don't know how that happened. It could be something really simple, like a poorly timed sneeze. But on social media, even in the newspaper, people are wondering, was it the ventilation system in the building? Was it the plumbing? It's really indicative of how worried people are, how much they want clarity about exactly how the virus spreads, and how hard it is when you don't have that clarity.
Is there any evidence to suggest whether any of those theories you just mentioned could possibly be correct?
Well, the short answer is no. There's no specific evidence that, for example, the virus could be spreading through plumbing. One of the top epidemiologists at the University of Hong Kong went on the radio today and said basically, do not panic about this. But there's still a lot we don't know. We still don't know exactly how the disease is transmitted. It's difficult to track how the outbreak is evolving over time because epidemiologists don't have all the information about the cases that have been confirmed, like when people got sick exactly, if they got better, how long that took. If people die, when that happened relative to everything else. You need all that information to get a complete picture of how the virus is transmitted, how it affects people, how deadly it is. And it can be hard to get doctors and epidemiologists in China to talk on the record because the state has such a tight hold on the health system.
Now, we were talking with a doctor in Wuhan, which is the center of this outbreak here on NPR News. Dr. Li Yang is her name, and she was saying that there is a problem with getting information out of China's authoritarian government. Let's listen.
At the beginning of this outbreak, if the scientists can get more information from these cases, we probably could have understood this outbreak better.
Has a tight hold on information slowed the authorities' possible response?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And it means that because there's not a ton of information, scientists are playing catch-up in a way. The longer it takes to study the outbreak, to really understand it, the more work you make for public health officials who are just trying to reassure people, keep them calm, because nothing stokes fear quite like not knowing.
Rebecca, thanks for telling us what we do know.
Thanks.
That's NPR's Rebecca Hersher in Hong Kong. Here in the United States, active shooter drills have become common in schools.
That's right. But today, the country's two biggest teachers' unions are issuing a new recommendation. They want public schools to rethink these simulations. About 95% of American public schools run some form of these drills, but concern is growing about how they might traumatize children.
NPR's education correspondent Anya Kamenetz joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What are the recommendations?
So the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, those are the two big teacher unions, have teamed up with the gun advocacy group Everytown for Gun Safety. And together they're releasing a report today where they say they do not recommend that children participate in these drills. And if schools do choose to use these drills, they say they should never be unannounced, which is something that's been happening, and they should not be overly realistic. The report wants schools to focus on prevention measures. One best practice is threat assessment, where you kind of surround a troubled kid with services, including mental health services and referrals. I'm just thinking this through. I guess we're being told here that these drills themselves can be traumatizing, whether kids ever go through a shooting or not. What is the experience like for many kids? Well, I've talked to students who say they can be terrifying, especially when they're not fully announced. They're sometimes called lockdowns, so classroom doors are locked. Sometimes students practice hiding or running away from, even fighting back against an attacker. In one documented case in Indiana, teachers were shot and injured with pellet guns during one of these drills. I talked to a fourth grade teacher, Abby Clements, and she was actually a teacher in 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School when a shooter walked in and killed mostly first graders, about 26 people. And she still teaches today in Newtown, Connecticut, and she told me that her district doesn't use these drills because they want to avoid scaring students. This is Abby.
If that is good enough for Newtown, shouldn't that be good enough for all districts across the country? Well, I do have to ask. Clearly, some people think that these drills are useful because they've become so widespread. Is anyone still defending them?
Sure. I mean, again, 95% of schools are doing them. I think school shootings are so rare that we really don't have much empirical evidence to support any kind of security measure. But in the meantime, this giant school security industry has sprung up really in the years, especially since Newtown. It's reportedly worth almost $3 billion. And I talked to Guy Grace. He's the chairman of the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools, which is a educator industry partnership. And he insisted to me that student participation in twice-a-year lockdown drills is key and central to violence preparedness. But Grace actually agreed with the teacher unions that simulations of violence aren't a good idea, and also that drills should never be unannounced. So there's some agreement there. I'm just thinking this through. You have teachers who want to do something, school administrators who want to do something. They hire consultants who aren't being paid to tell you to do nothing, and they end up with these drills. Is that what seems to be happening here? That's exactly right. And you have, kindergartners who are terrified to go to the bathroom at school, and people that have nightmares, children that have trauma in their lives, and they go to school. School is supposed to be safe and welcoming, and this is their experience. Anya, thanks for the insight. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, so New Hampshire, unlike Iowa, quickly had a clear winner.
And the results began to clarify the Democratic presidential race. Bernie Sanders won the primary. Pete Buttigieg finished a close second, and that plus the muddled results in Iowa give Buttigieg the most delegates so far for the Democratic convention. Amy Klobuchar finished a strong third in New Hampshire, which gives her a chance to push on. Joe Biden skipped ahead to South Carolina while some other candidates dropped out.
And if it's the morning after voting, it means we hear from NPR's Scott Detrow, who is in Manchester. Hi, Scott.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. So you had a late night watching Bernie Sanders celebrate this victory. What did it feel like in there?
It was a real electric mood there, and really such a night and day difference from a week ago where everybody drifted out of the party before a single result was known.
Right.
The room just exploded when the race was called for Bernie Sanders and when he came out to speak. And look, was this the 20-point margin that Sanders won New Hampshire by 4 years ago? It was not. But this was a big deal, and combined with what happened in Iowa, it gives him an inside edge over everyone else right now. On one hand, he only got about a quarter of the vote, and when you add up the totals of the votes going to all the moderate candidates, that's way more support than what Sanders is getting. But here's what he has going for him. He has better organization and advertising and strength in the next few contests than anybody else, and he has more resources in the states that vote on March 3rd. So yeah, right now, Sanders is in maybe the strongest position of any Democrat running for president.
Well, talking about strong positions, Scott, I mean, you have Amy Klobuchar, who came in third place right behind Buttigieg and Sanders. I mean, what does her success last night tell us about where Democratic voters are right now?
I think it tells us that they have no idea who they want the alternative to Bernie Sanders to be. Pete Buttigieg had another strong night, a close second to Sanders, but there are a lot of signs that Klobuchar won a lot of the votes of people who decided at the last minute. A lot of people deciding between her and Buttigieg, between her and Warren even, and a lot ended up breaking her way, giving her this good night and putting her in the conversation now.
As everyone had counted us out, even a week ago, thank you, pundits, I came back and we delivered.
And speaking for pundits, I would say she's right about that. For most of the last year, she was overshadowed by other senators in the race, particularly Elizabeth Warren, who led nationally at one point, who set the tone for the race for a good chunk of last year. But Warren's support faded at the worst possible moment, even in a state right next to her home state. She came in fourth. She doesn't win a single delegate, but she does insist that she is staying in the race going forward.
Okay, so we move on now to Nevada, to South Carolina, more diverse states. And I wonder, could that mean some challenges for Pete Buttigieg, who, had another strong showing, but he hasn't really been doing well with non-white voters?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge for him and for Klobuchar and makes it clear that there's not going to be a clear alternative to Sanders to emerge anytime soon. Both of them, Buttigieg especially, have very low traction among voters of color. And they're going to have to prove themselves now as the race shifts to two very different states. Nevada, one of the most diverse states in the country with a big Latino vote, and South Carolina, where a majority of the Democratic electorate is African American. They need to gain ground in ways that they just haven't shown they can before.
And then you have Joe Biden, who was not so long ago seen as the front runner, literally getting out of New Hampshire early because things were looking so bad and getting to South Carolina. Where does his campaign go now?
I think there are real doubts about that. He is now banking everything on South Carolina, even more than Nevada, and there's a really long time before South Carolina votes and no guarantee that this plan of banking on support there will work. And it's especially risky because there's only a few days between South Carolina and Super Tuesday where a third of the delegates are on the line. So I think Joe Biden is looking much more vulnerable than he ever thought he'd be in this point.
NPR's Scott Detrows in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thanks, Scott, and safe travels.
Thanks a lot.
So the federal prosecutors who tried the case against President Trump's former advisor Roger Stone have quit the case.
All four of the Justice Department lawyers backed away after the Trump administration overruled their approach. The prosecutor's job here was to recommend a length of a prison sentence for Stone's criminal conviction. They proposed 7 to 9 years for the president's friend. The president did not like this. He announced his displeasure on Twitter, and the prosecutor's bosses in the Justice Department stepped in to seek a shorter sentence.
And NPR's justice correspondent Ryan Lucas has been following all of this. Hey, Ryan.
Good morning.
Start by reminding us about Roger Stone and why he was on trial in the first place.
So the case against him was brought by special counsel Robert Mueller as part of the Russia investigation. Stone was charged with obstruction, false statements, and witness tampering. And these charges related to his efforts to act as an intermediary between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks during the 2016 presidential race. The case went to trial. A jury here in D.C. convicted Stone in November on all 7 counts. He's set to be sentenced in federal court here next Thursday. Now, as part of this sentencing process, defense attorneys and prosecutors file memos to the court in which they tell the judge what sentence they think the defendant should get. In Stone's case, both sides did that Monday. Stone's lawyers asked for probation. Prosecutors, on the other hand, recommended a sentence in the guidelines range of 7 to 9 years.
Well, Steve mentioned, that's the role of prosecutors to make a recommendation like that. So then how does the Department of Justice, these prosecutors' bosses, get involved, and what do they have to do with this?
That's a good question. What a senior Justice Department official told me is that the department was shocked by the 7 to 9 year recommendation. I'm told that it's not the recommendation that the department had been briefed on, and that the department found that proposed sentence excessive, thought that it was disproportionate to Stone's crimes. So yesterday evening, the department took the extraordinary step of filing a supplemental sentencing memo to the court. And in that document, the same Justice Department says that Stone should serve some time behind bars. It doesn't make a specific recommendation on how much time that should be, but it says it should be far less than the original proposal of 7 to 9 years.
Okay, so key question. Is it unusual for the Justice Department to intervene in this way?
So I spoke to several former prosecutors about this, and they all said that it is highly, highly unusual. One former U.S. attorney told me that it's essentially unheard of. Yes, U.S. attorneys' offices do communicate with the department leadership on cases, particularly big cases, but I'm told it's very rare for the leadership to step in and overrule career prosecutors when it comes to the sentencing of a case. What makes this particular matter raise even more questions is the timing. A few hours before the department stepped in to overrule these prosecutors and instead seek a lighter sentence, President Trump had tweeted that Stone was being treated unfairly. And remember, Trump and Stone have been friends for decades.
Right.
A Justice Department official tells me that the decision to revise the recommendation was made Monday night, so before Trump's tweet. But the timeline still, either way, has raised a ton of questions about the independence of the Justice Department in the Trump administration and whether Attorney General William Barr is adequately protecting the department's independence from the president.
Well, also raising questions is these prosecutors on the case resigning after seeing all of this. I mean, so what happens now?
Well, these four prosecutors are the ones who handled Stone's prosecution. They're the ones who tried him in court. They are career folks. They filed papers with the court to withdraw from the case. One of them, Jonathan Kravis, has actually resigned from his job at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. This turmoil is about the Justice Department because when it comes to Stone's sentencing next week, the decision lies in the hands of Judge Amy Berman Jackson. She's the one who will ultimately make the decision on how much time Stone spends behind bars.
NPR's Ryan Lucas. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thank you.
All right, so Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido is back in Caracas, feeling emboldened.
He flew in after a 3-week tour overseas in which he met with President Trump and also with European leaders. He's been trying to build support abroad for his campaign to oust President Nicolas Maduro. And here's the welcome that Guaido got after returning home.
NPR's Philip Reeves was there and joins us now. And Phil, what are we listening to there?
Well, you're listening to a big crowd, and that crowd included a lot of supporters of Maduro's government and the ruling Socialist Party, and they heckled Guaido from the moment he arrived at passport control. One reason for that is that among that crowd there were a lot of employees from the Venezuelan state airline Conviasa that's based at that airport. And the airline was hit by U.S. sanctions last week. Those employees were mobilized to protest against those and against Guaido's arrival. They included Elsa Villela. She says Guaido should be arrested and imprisoned. She's had enough of him, and her co-workers around her applauded that after she finished speaking. But Guaido was also met by supporters, including opposition lawmakers from the National Assembly. They say that on their way to the airport, Maduro's security forces stopped their vehicles, so they had to walk the last 3 kilometers. And when they got there, they tried to greet Guaido on his arrival, but it was very chaotic. He moved through the airport quickly. He was jostled. He had his shirt pulled. People banged on his car, and brawls broke out between opposing sides that continued after he drove away.
Can you just remind me of the political context for all of this? I mean, why did Guaido, this opposition leader, leave his country in the first place?
Well, it's more than a year, David, since he first asserted his claim to be the interim president of Venezuela and won recognition from the US and dozens of other countries. There have been signs recently that his campaign to oust Maduro was flagging. This tour was supposed to pump some air into his tires. He met Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel and Donald Trump. But some of Guaido's supporters say what really impressed them while he was on this tour was the bipartisan ovation he received at the US Congress when he was a guest at the State of the Union. They include Henrietta Porcher, who's part of Guaido's support team.
Everybody's with Guaido once again. People are recovering like the belief in Guaido.
Why? Why has that changed?
Well, I think the last thing that we have to lose is hope. If we lose hope, I think we lose the country, and we're all aware of that.
So after arriving, Guaido then went to a plaza in Caracas to try to keep that hope alive, and he made a speech saying that he plans to finish the job of reclaiming the nation, in his words. But that will be a job that is difficult and complex because he's got to find new ways of pressuring President Nicolas Maduro in order to oust him from office at a time when the economy is showing signs, although being dire, is showing some signs of stabilization.
NPR's Philip Reeves covering this competition for power in Venezuela. Phil, thanks so much.
Contests in New Hampshire and Iowa have done little to resolve the Democratic Party's divisions between moderates and progressives.
That's right. Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar are hoping to carry their momentum to Nevada and to South Carolina. These three candidates span the party's ideological spectrum. So what does this tell us about what Democratic voters want?
NPR's national political correspondent Don Gagne is with us now. Hi, Don.
Hi there.
Start off by just giving us the lay of the land. I mean, we've got Bernie Sanders winning the popular vote in both Iowa and New Hampshire. He's got momentum right now. Meanwhile, in the other lane, the person who had been the front runner for the so-called moderates in this race, Vice President Biden, did not do well in either state. So where does that leave, in particular, the Democratic Party establishment?
Well, it's up for grabs, to say the least. Maybe Pete Buttigieg is the center-left candidate who's done the best so far, at least in voting. But he could have a bumpy road in South Carolina and Nevada, where the African-American and Latino votes play a much larger role. There's Amy Klobuchar, who's also more to the center in policy and temperament. But she's rising, but again, still hasn't established herself. Maybe the big wild card is Mike Bloomberg, the former New York City mayor. He certainly embodies the establishment in his manner and his look with those suits he wears, but he's not been a Democrat for very long. Still, he's got the money to help him stake that claim.
Right. So speaking of the former mayor of New York City, he hasn't even been on a ballot yet. I mean, he just decided to forego Iowa and New Hampshire. He's going to appear on his first primary ballots on Super Tuesday on March 3rd. How is that expected to confuse, complicate the situation?
It's guaranteed to. How's that?
Right.
And I'm actually following Bloomberg this week, and we are in the South. We're in North Carolina right now, Tennessee, 2 stops yesterday, then to Texas tonight. It is interesting that polls show Bloomberg has decent support among African-American voters. Again, despite his support for that stop-and-frisk policy when he was mayor of New York, and a tape that surfaced this week where he was talking about racial profiling in positive terms. Mm-hmm. He's since said that those words don't really reflect who he is as a businessman and as someone who governed in New York. But he has also this week picked up endorsements from some members of the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as some prominent black mayors. Yeah. And that cuts into some support that had been assumed to be Joe Biden's.
Huh. So what about his money? I mean, his money is helping him, right? He's able to put all this money into TV ads. At the same time, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because Democrats don't so much like the idea that someone can just come in at the last minute and spend all this cash.
Well, he spent like $350 million so far. Right. It's an issue for Democrats, especially progressives. There have been protests at Bloomberg events about billionaires. But listen to this undecided voter who was in Chattanooga. His name's Tom Paulson. I asked him about Bloomberg and the claims that he's maybe trying to buy the presidency.
I want to see Trump beat. I don't care if it's going to take a lot of money. Anyway, the costs of the campaigns these days are just out of sight.
So it's almost like he says, Trump's a rich guy. You got to fight fire with fire.
NPR's Don Gagne traveling with the Mike Bloomberg campaign, following him. Thanks so much, Don.
My pleasure.
All right, the U.S. Department of Education announced late yesterday it is investigating 2 elite U.S. universities. We're talking about Yale and Harvard.
Right, and here's the reason. The government says they potentially failed to report hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign gifts and contracts. This move is part of a broader crackdown pushing colleges and universities to be more transparent about benefits they are getting from organizations and governments in China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Russia, among other places.
All right, to help us make sense of this, we've got NPR's Corey Turner in studio. Good morning, Corey.
Good morning, Rachel.
So what exactly is the Ed Department saying Harvard and Yale did wrong?
Well, it's saying they violated a part of the Higher Education Act. It's called Section 117. And it says colleges and universities have to report to the U.S. government any contracts or gifts from foreign sources if they're worth more than $250,000. Okay. So in the case of Yale, though, the department says the school apparently failed to report at least $375 million in foreign gifts and contracts and chose not to report any gifts over the last 4 years. And the department says similarly, it's also concerned that Harvard hasn't fully disclosed all foreign gifts or contracts.
Is it just Harvard and Yale?
No, not by a long shot. And we should say we reached out to both Harvard and Yale, and they confirmed to NPR that they have received this notice of investigation. They are preparing to respond. But the government has absolutely been looking into a lot of other schools, including Georgetown, Texas A&M, Cornell, Rutgers, MIT, Maryland. This is a widespread problem. The department says since July 1st of just last year, its enforcement efforts have triggered the reporting of approximately $6.5 billion in previously undisclosed foreign money.
So what's the Trump administration really concerned about?
Well, it's concerned about a few things. Espionage, certainly. It wants to protect U.S. intellectual property and research. It also wants to make sure foreign governments aren't exercising undue influence. And its chief concern here seems to be China. Remember, the chair of Harvard's chemistry department was arrested for allegedly lying to Defense Department investigators about lucrative research contracts he may have had with the Chinese government. There was a Senate investigation last year. It found nearly 2/3 of U.S. schools that received more than that threshold, $250,000, from what it calls a propaganda arm of the Chinese government, failed to report it. This Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, it also requested the financial records from about 100 U.S. schools, and it found that this extension of the Chinese government directly contributed $113 million to these U.S. schools, more than 7 times the amount they actually reported. And so, as a result, Rachel, basically the Senate kind of brought the hammer down on Ed for not enforcing the law, and so the department's basically bringing the hammer down on schools now.
So how are schools defending themselves? This seems like a big oversight.
Well, here's the thing. So I spent a lot of last night on the phone. No one denies that this is a problem. There's lots of foreign money flowing into campuses, but there are also lots of reasons for it. Number one, state funding for higher ed still hasn't really rebounded since the Great Recession, but also that a lot of cutting-edge research, they say, these contracts, they're not about money, they're about collaboration. So they're important. They simply need to report it. But I also heard a few people being critical of the Ed Department saying, yeah, this law has been on the books since the 80s, but the Ed Department never actually regulated it. They never wrote any rules to make clear to schools, this is what you need to report, and this is how you need to do it. So there's plenty of blame to go around.
All right, NPR's Corey Turner with us on that story. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel.
All right, the head of U.S. Customs and Border Protection made a surprising admission this week. It was about the agency's Seattle field office.
Yeah, officers at a border crossing in Washington state were pulling aside Iranian Americans, including green card holders. The people were held for hours, and this generated a ton of backlash. CBP is now conceding that the leaders of the Seattle field office were, quote, overzealous. Immigrant advocates are warning that this problem is actually widespread.
NPR's Joel Rose covers immigration and has been following this and joins us now. Hey, Joel.
Hey, Rachel.
So you do not hear this a lot, CBP acknowledging mistakes. What happened?
Right. This is significant. This event, as you say, happened a little more than a month ago, right after the U.S. airstrike, you may remember, that killed a top Iranian general.
Right.
Tensions with Iran were rising. And Customs and Border Protection headquarters in Washington put out the word for its field offices to be more vigilant. But this field office, in particular in Seattle, had a very strong reaction. It was stopping all Iranian Americans at this major border crossing between Vancouver, Canada, and Seattle. It was holding them for questioning for hours, some of them quite late into the night. And acting CBP Commissioner Mark Morgan now says that was not what his field offices were instructed to do.
In that specific office, leadership just got a little overzealous. That was not in line with our direction. And so that was immediately corrected, and it was very unique to that one sector.
Corrected, but it still meant that American citizens were detained for hours on end. I mean, do we know what will happen to the officers who were involved?
Well, Morgan did not say. He only said that the situation was immediately, quote, unquote, corrected, as you just heard. CBP actually denies that they were detained also. That's a sort of a dirty word for CBP. They say they were held in question. And, we should say border officers have broad discretion at the ports of entry. They have a mandate to protect the country, and they can reject foreign travelers, even if that person has a valid visa. What border officers cannot do, however, is target certain nationalities for additional scrutiny. They need something more specific as the basis for their suspicion. And it appears in this case that the Seattle's field office kind of skipped over that second step.
So Morgan is saying essentially this was an isolated mistake in this Seattle field office. But this has happened to other Iranian travelers with valid visas at different ports of entry, right?
Well, exactly. In particular, students from Iran who are coming to the U.S. to study they've been subjected to extra scrutiny. We know of nearly 20 cases of students who've gone through security vetting by U.S. authorities and issued student visas, and then landed at airports in the U.S. only to be turned around and sent back to the Middle East. I spoke to one of these students, a young woman from Iran who was planning to study at Harvard Divinity School. She was questioned for hours by CBP officers in Boston and never did understand why she was eventually rejected. She's now banned from coming to the U.S. for 5 years, although she is fighting that in court. CBP says there is no connection between what happened in Seattle and what happened to these students around the country. But advocate groups, including the ACLU, are not so sure. They are suing to try to get more information about what happened.
All right, NPR's Joel Rose for us. Thank you, Joel. We appreciate it.
Attorney General William Barr criticized President Trump yesterday.
He said this to ABC News.
It's time to stop the tweeting about Department of Justice criminal cases.
This comes after President Trump tweeted repeatedly about the sentencing of Roger Stone, a friend of Trump's who was indicted as part of the Mueller investigation.
Justice correspondent Ryan Lucas has been following all of this. He's in studio with us. Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning.
So what was notable about what Attorney General Barr said yesterday?
Well, this is the first time that we've seen Barr publicly push back against the president like this. Barr's predecessor as Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, never did. In this ABC interview, Barr made clear that he views the president's tweets about the department, its employees, the cases that they're prosecuting, and the judges that they prosecute these cases before, that these tweets are a problem for Barr. He said they make it impossible for him to do his job. And he also said that neither the president nor his tweets nor any other outside noise is going to affect the decisions that he makes as Attorney General.
I'm not going to be bullied or influenced by anybody. And I said at the time, whether it's Congress, newspaper, editorial boards, or the president, I'm going to do what I think is right. And, I cannot do my job here at the department with a constant background commentary that undercuts me.
Okay, so strong words. I can't do my job here if this keeps up. What did the White House say?
Well, there was some speculation after this interview first aired that the president wouldn't be happy about this sort of pushback from his attorney general. It has to be said, though, that Barr and Trump do have a pretty solid relationship. Barr has been in the job now for a full year, actually, as of today. Last night, though, after this interview came out, the White House press secretary put out a statement that said the president wasn't bothered by Barr's comments at all and said that the president has full confidence in the attorney general to do his job and to uphold the law.
Do we have a sense of why Barr did this interview and why now?
Well, this appears to be an attempt at damage control by the attorney general. Barr has come under an immense amount of criticism, particularly from the legal world, former Justice Department folks, for intervening this week in the case against Roger Stone, as we mentioned earlier. Barr overruled career prosecutors to recommend a lighter sentence for Stone, and he did so after President Trump tweeted that Stone was being treated unfairly. After Barr intervened in the case, the president congratulated Barr on Twitter about that. This has all blown up on Barr. The 4 prosecutors handling Stone's case, they all quit the case. One of them even resigned from the Justice Department. Now, Barr says that he made the decision to intervene in Stone's case before the president's tweets. But appearances matter when it comes to the Justice Department, when it comes to its credibility and the perception of fairness. To a lot of people, it appeared that Barr was maybe weighing in on the Stone case for political reasons. And that has raised a lot of questions about whether the Justice Department is being politicized under Barr's watch and whether he's allowing it to essentially bend to the president's wishes.
And here he is saying that's not what's happening.
Right.
What happens next in Roger Stone's sentencing? When does that go on?
Well, his sentencing will be next Thursday here in federal court in Washington, D.C. There's been a lot of back and forth about the sentencing recommendation by the government, but remember, it's actually the judge in this case, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who makes the final call on how much time behind bars Roger Stone is going to spend. There is going to be a ton of attention on that now after this whole blow up over the past week.
Okay. NPR Justice correspondent Ryan Lucas. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thank you.
The Defense Department notified Congress yesterday that it plans to reallocate $3.8 billion that the Pentagon had earmarked for other things.
Right. And instead, now it's going to go to the Department of Homeland Security and then used to build an additional 177 miles of President Trump's border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. At least that's what the president wants to happen.
NPR's John Burnett covers immigration. He's on the line from Austin, Texas. Hey, John.
Morning, Noel.
So what was the Department of Defense supposed to use that $3.8 billion for?
Well, the first time the Pentagon gave Trump money, which was a year ago, it came from military construction and counter-narcotics operations. This time, the DoD is pulling it from serious military hardware. 2 F-35 Air Force fighter jets, 2 Osprey aircraft for the Marines, a Navy reconnaissance plane, 8 drones, as well as trucks and other gear the National Guard was counting on. Instead, they'll use that money, nearly $4 billion, to build more of Trump's steel and concrete wall. And in order to pull this off yesterday, the president redeclared a national emergency based on, quote, the ongoing border security and humanitarian crisis at the southern border, which is surprising because the apprehensions of undocumented immigrants has plummeted 75% over the past 6 months. The Pentagon says it will be putting up this additional wall to block drug smuggling corridors out in the deserts in Arizona, New Mexico, California. But DEA numbers tell us that most illegal drugs come through ports of entry rather than cross-country.
So, John, in the meantime, as we're talking about all of these billions of dollars, it does seem like the price tag on the wall keeps going up and up. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. The last status report I saw from Customs and Border Protection said they're putting up about 575 miles of new wall for $11 billion. If you add this, now we're looking at something like 750 miles, and it's pushing $15 billion. This is already the most expensive border wall in the world at $20 million a mile. Democrats in Congress have not given the president all the money he had asked for to spend on the wall, so Trump has now declared national emergencies twice so he could go to the military and say, I need you to help me build my wall to protect the country's southern flank.
And is what the president's doing legal?
Well, several anti-wall groups sued him before, and they said only Congress has the purse and the president can't go around them and help himself to the Pentagon's coffers. The lower courts agreed, and they blocked military funds to build the wall. But then conservative justices on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and on the Supreme Court have allowed the president to keep using the military as his emergency piggy bank for the wall. Nonetheless, the American Civil Liberties Union said yesterday it'll go back to federal court and ask a judge to block these new transfers of military money for the wall. Notably, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, a Republican from the Texas Panhandle, didn't sound too happy about the announcement. He said Congress gave DOD its budget, and DOD cannot change its priorities without congressional approval. That, quote, undermines the principle of civilian control of the military and violates the separation of powers. He said it's unconstitutional. This from a presidential supporter. So we'll see how it all plays out.
Interesting. NPR's John Burnett in Austin. Thanks, John.
My pleasure.
All right, so how do you stop an illness from spreading when there is no vaccine and no treatment?
That's a problem that DARPA is grappling with. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's a U.S. defense agency that develops cutting-edge techniques primarily to help the military. And this is happening at a critical time, right? China's Hubei province reported more than 14,000 new cases of the coronavirus yesterday.
NPR science correspondent Joe Palca is in the studio with us. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning.
So what is DARPA doing exactly?
Well, they've created this platform called the P3, the Pandemic Prevention Platform, And it's actually a 4-year program. We're in the middle of it that started 2 years ago. And their idea is to respond rapidly to any emerging threat. And it just happens now that COVID-19 is the threat. But they want to be able to respond where there is, as you said, no vaccine or no drug. So Amy Jenkins runs the program for DARPA.
We envision the P3 platform actually functioning as a fire break in the instance that there's a pandemic outbreak.
What does that mean, fire break?
Well, it's something that will work at least temporarily to protect someone from contracting the virus before a vaccine is ready. It might also be a stopgap therapy if there's nothing else available. And the Defense Department is interested because they are in a situation where they might have to deploy troops into an area where there is a pandemic. Not that they're thinking about doing it now, but they might someday. And even if there were a vaccine, if you give somebody a shot with a vaccine, it still takes a couple of weeks, usually, for someone to develop immunity. So they want something they can put into the troop right away, and off they go, and they won't be hurt. And the idea is that this will at least give them temporary protection, maybe 6 months or so, and then they will still be able to get a vaccine to protect them against any further exposure.
How does this P3 thing work?
Well, it has two parts. Part number one is they're trying to develop techniques to find antibodies that would work against the invading organism. Now, antibodies are what our immune systems create to fight infection. And what they're going to do is take blood from people who have gotten sick with this COVID-19 virus and then take their blood and look for antibodies in the blood. And that's part of it is they're trying to speed up the time it takes to find those antibodies. The second part is to produce those antibodies in sufficient quantities to be able to give to troops. Now, usually that means putting them in big bioreactors, which are big stainless steel tanks that grow the proteins that are making up the antibodies. They're trying to do something different. They're going to take the genetic material that codes for the antibodies and put them into people and let people's own cells make the antibodies.
Gosh, that is really interesting. So I guess the big question here is, are they working on anything that will be usable or useful for COVID-19, which is what the coronavirus is being called formally?
Of course. Well, I put that question to DARPA's Amy Jenkins.
This technology could be used in this current coronavirus. I will caveat that this is still a very early technology. It has, yes, been in human clinical studies, but it has not been in thousands of patients. It's been in tens of patients.
So she's saying maybe. And we talked about this. They were hoping when they started the program to be able to provide something in 60 days. And now she's saying, well, maybe with these caveats that she just mentioned, it might take 90 days. But still, she's saying it's possible that they'll have something to add to the armamentarium to fight this.
Some amount of room for optimism, yeah?
I would say.
NPR's Joe Palca.